In the grand halls of Versailles, where once gilded mirrors reflected the splendor of absolute monarchy, by 1774 an entirely different image emerged: decay, corruption, and human frailty. The king, who had once been called Louis the Well-Beloved, would end his life remembered as Louis the Hated. His body fell victim not only to smallpox but also to the moral rot of his own reign. His decaying corpse became the perfect symbol of a monarchy that had already begun to collapse from within. The reign of Louis XV has gone down in history as one of the most dramatic reversals of fortune, a cautionary tale of unchecked power and abandoned responsibility. When smallpox struck him in May 1774, it consumed his body with such violence that even his most loyal servants fled from the stench, leaving their king alone. Yet this horrific end was only the final act of a decades-long downfall, one that paved the way for one of history's greatest revolutions. To understand Louis's tragic demise, we must look back. How did one of Europe's most promising child rulers become one of France's most despised kings? His story does not begin with a dying tyrant gasping on his sick bed, but with the innocence of a 5-year-old thrust upon the throne. The chasm between the child king and the corrupt despot reveals the full picture of the moral and physical decay that defined his reign. The year 1715 marked a turning point for France. The Sun King, Louis XIV, after an unprecedented 72-year reign, finally died, leaving behind both grandeur and a mountain of debt. The throne passed to his 5-year-old great-grandson, Louis XV. The young boy inherited not only the crown, but also the immense expectations of a nation that had lived under the rule of a single monarch for nearly 3/4 of a century. He was already orphaned, having lost both parents to disease. During his minority, France was governed under the regency of Philippe d'Eu. These years, following the financial ruin caused by Louis XIV's endless wars, brought a period of relative recovery. The young Louis received the best education available, studying history, mathematics, diplomacy, and the arts of war. His tutors noted his sharp intellect and potential as a future king. The French people looked to their new sovereign with hope, believing a new golden age for France had begun. When Louis assumed power in 1723, the people truly loved him. Handsome, intelligent, and youthful, he was given the title Louis le Bien-Aimé, Louis, the Well-Beloved. The name was not ironic, but born of genuine admiration. Across France, people believed he would bring reform, prosperity, and renewal. The early years of his reign seemed to justify these hopes. He married Marie Lecheska, daughter of the deposed King of Poland, in a splendid ceremony that reinforced France's dominance in European politics. Their marriage appeared affectionate, and the Queen quickly bore numerous heirs, securing the succession. Louis also showed interest in science and the arts, supporting philosophers and inventors, while strengthening France's reputation as the cultural heart of Europe. But within this hopeful beginning lay the seeds of future disaster. Louis increasingly revealed an indecisive character and relied on favorites and mistresses for political counsel. Unlike his predecessor Louis XIV, who had cultivated an image of divine authority and discipline, Louis XV appeared more devoted to pleasure than to responsibility. Versailles gradually became a center of debauchery, its reputation soon swelling into scandal. The transformation from beloved to hated did not occur overnight. Years of wars, scandals, and poor decisions steadily eroded the people's trust. Each crisis revealed more clearly France's desperate need for strong leadership, a need Louis failed to meet. What had begun as a reign full of promise slowly descended into a whirlpool of military defeat, financial ruin, and moral corruption. Louis XV's first great test came with the War of Austrian Succession, which began in 1740 and lasted for 8 years. France entered the war to counter Britain and support Prussia, its traditional ally, but the conflict exposed the weaknesses that would haunt Louis's rule. Unlike Louis XIV's carefully planned campaigns, Louis XV's wars were plagued by vague goals and incoherent strategies, reflecting both the king's indecision and the growing dysfunction of his government. The war devastated France financially. New taxes and loans piled onto the already immense debt. The French army, once the terror of Europe, suffered humiliating defeats and was forced to surrender most of its conquests. Worse still, Louis personally led troops into battle, which briefly won him popularity but quickly exposed his incompetence. His decisions were guided more by court intrigues and personal relationships than by sound strategy. Meanwhile, his marriage unraveled. Louis surrounded himself with a succession of mistresses. The most influential of these was Madame de Pompadour, who became not only his lover but also his political advisor. This scandalized the court and the people, who saw it as proof of the king's corruption and poor judgment. The growing influence of royal mistresses in state affairs steadily undermined confidence in the monarchy. The war ended in 1748 with the Treaty of Aix, but the peace only deepened public resentment. France gave up its hard-won territories, leaving citizens furious. Years of bloodshed and taxation had achieved nothing. People felt their sons had died for no reason and their taxes had been squandered. This moment marked the turning point in public opinion. The nickname Louis the Well-Beloved now echoed with bitter irony. Louis XV responded to criticism not by drawing closer to his people, but by withdrawing further behind the gilded walls of Versailles. He confined himself to a small circle that told him only what he wanted to hear. This detachment became a defining feature of his later reign, as the king increasingly lost the capacity to understand and address the struggles of his subjects. The gulf between the luxury of Versailles and the poverty of ordinary Frenchmen grew ever wider throughout the 1750s. His devotion to pleasure and indulgence proved even more destructive than France's military defeats. Stories of extravagant spending on mistresses and favorites spread across the kingdom. While many were exaggerated, enough truth lay within them to fuel resentment. The most infamous example was the construction of the Petit Trianon for Madame de Pompadour, which became a symbol of the king's priorities, personal desires over public duty. The 7 Years' War, beginning in 1756, was a catastrophe for France. In this global conflict, France confronted Britain and Prussia both in Europe and overseas. From the outset, French armies suffered crushing defeats. The loss of major colonies such as Canada and Louisiana shattered France's global empire. The French people watched their imperial power crumble while their king seemed preoccupied with courtly pleasures. The relentless costs of war brought the kingdom to the brink of bankruptcy. New taxes were levied, falling hardest on peasants and common citizens, while the nobility and the church maintained their traditional exemptions. This injustice became one of the greatest sources of popular anger toward both the monarchy and the privileged classes. Louis XV never showed the political will or courage to enact meaningful financial reform. His indecision, compounded by entrenched resistance from vested interests, only deepened the crisis. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 reduced France to a second-rate power. The king, once the pride of Europe, now stood as the symbol of national decline. It was in these years that the seeds of the revolutionary ideas, which would one day destroy the monarchy, were sown. In the years following the war, Louis withdrew even further from the problems of the state. While his people struggled with famine and debt, he spent his days hunting, entertaining mistresses, and basking in the ceremonies of Versailles. The disconnect between royal luxury and national misery became the focal point of criticism. That the king's dependence on favorites reached its peak in this period. Madame de Pompadour and later Madame du Barry were not only his lovers, but influential advisors in the most crucial affairs of state. To the public, this was irrefutable evidence of the monarchy's moral decay. Government offices were perceived to be distributed not on merit, but through court intrigue and sexual favoritism, corroding confidence in the entire system. Religious matters also damaged the king. The expulsion of the Jesuits in 1764 pleased some groups, but alienated the monarchy's traditional Catholic supporters. At the same time, Louis's indulgent lifestyle seemed incompatible with his title of eldest son of the church. These criticisms struck at the very core of his legitimacy. Throughout the 1760s, the economic crisis worsened. The tax system remained unjust, the national debt grew, and reform efforts failed, one after another. Louis's indifference destroyed his reputation among the rising bourgeoisie and reform-minded nobility, who saw economic renewal as essential for France's future. Social unrest swelled, hunger and hardship sparked riots and uprisings. The government's response was almost always military repression rather than addressing grievances. This only fueled popular anger and reinforced the view of Louis as a tyrant detached from his people. Meanwhile, the Enlightenment surged. Thinkers like Voltaire, Rousseau, and Diderot challenged absolute monarchy and the doctrine of divine right. At first confined to elites, these ideas gradually reached the broader public. Louis XV's personal vices and administrative failures provided a living example of the corruption and incompetence Enlightenment philosophers condemned. The king attempted to silence criticism through censorship and repression, but this only found interest in forbidden ideas. In 1757, the assassination attempt by Robert Francois d'Amiens revealed with shocking clarity just how much hatred the king had provoked among his people. Although the attack on Louis XV was condemned, the mildness of Damiens's wound and his testimony revealed that even a would-be regicide could find sympathy among the French people. Even after the end of major wars, humiliations on the international stage continued to overshadow Louis's reign. France's inability to prevent the partition of Poland, despite centuries of alliance, gravely damaged the monarchy's prestige. The king's foreign policy appeared increasingly ineffective and disorganized, reacting to events rather than shaping them. This perception of weakness fueled domestic criticism and further contributed to France's decline in European standing. By the late 1760s, the gulf between the monarchy and its subjects had deepened dangerously. The people no longer believed the king capable of governing effectively or caring about their welfare. Economic, social, and political problems were now clearly visible, and the sparks of the coming revolution had already appeared. But Louis was either unwilling or unable to confront them. When the 1770s began, France was still staggering under the burdens accumulated over decades of misrule. The national debt had reached catastrophic levels. One finance minister after another promised reform, only to fail. While the king's support was weak and easily withdrawn under pressure, this repeated cycle revealed again and again the monarchy's inability to solve its structural problems. At the same time, social unrest reached new heights. Poor harvests led to food shortages and bred riots in the cities. The crushing tax burden continued to fall on the poorest, while the nobility and clergy clung to their privileges. As the people starved, Versailles carried on with lavish feasts and entertainments, deepening public fury against the king. The king's private life also became a source of scandal. His relationship with Madame du Barry, a woman of low birth, provoked outrage among both nobles and commoners. Unlike his earlier mistresses, who at least preserved some semblance of dignity, du Barry was openly crude and mercenary. Her presence at court came to symbolize, for many, the complete moral decay of the monarchy. Religious tensions further eroded Louis's position. The dissolution of religious orders and his personal behavior alienated traditional Catholic supporters. His clashes with the Parliament of Paris over these issues escalated into a constitutional crisis. Louis responded by exiling the Parliament and replacing it with more compliant courts. But this only revealed his authoritarian tendencies, while failing to resolve the underlying disputes. Meanwhile, Enlightenment ideas were gaining strength. Philosophers such as Voltaire, Rousseau, and Diderot attacked absolute monarchy and proposed alternative systems of governance. Louis XV's personal vices and failures provided tangible examples for their critiques. The king's efforts at censorship and repression backfired, making forbidden ideas even more attractive to the public. On the international stage, France suffered repeated its diplomatic influence waned, while decisions were increasingly shaped by court intrigue and personal relationships rather than coherent national strategy. Each failure made France's decline more obvious. By the early 1770s, Louis's health began to deteriorate, yet he continued his hunting parties and court festivities. Observers wrote that he looked aged, weary, and spent. Still, no one could have foreseen that his death would come in such a horrific and symbolically fitting manner, mirroring the collapse of his reign. During these years, songs, pamphlets, and satirical writings spread rapidly despite censorship. Louis was no longer seen as a figure of grandeur but of ridicule. In the eyes of his people, the monarchy had already lost its legitimacy. All that was missing was the great spark that would bring down the old order. In April 1774, while staying at the Petit Trianon with Madame du Barry, Louis suddenly fell ill. What first seemed like simple exhaustion quickly became something far more serious. Severe headaches, fever, and fatigue worsened within days. On April 28, the dreaded diagnosis was confirmed: smallpox. One of Europe's most feared diseases, it struck kings and commoners alike with equal cruelty. This time, its victim was France's already discredited monarch. Those who understood the terrifying speed with which smallpox could spread began making preparations to flee. The king's physicians, Dr. Bordeaux and Dr. Lasson, were among the most respected doctors of their time. yet there was nothing they could do against the disease. The primitive methods of 18th century medicine, bloodletting, purging, and emetics only worsened Louis's suffering, hastening his death rather than delaying it. The doctor's helplessness shrouded Versailles in an atmosphere of despair and horror during those final days. The course of the illness was extraordinarily severe. In a short time, the king's body was covered with pustules filled with pus. Once considered one of Europe's most handsome monarchs, he now presented such a horrific sight that even his servants could not bear to look at him. The pustules burst, releasing foul-smelling fluids that filled the chambers with stench, making the palace unbearable. The odor was so overwhelming that even long-time servants refused to enter the king's room. Even the doctors could barely endure it. Versailles, once the temple of magnificence, had become a charnel house reeking of death. Alongside his physical collapse came spiritual devastation. Louis XV, who had always prided himself on his appearance and dignity, now faced his mortality in the most humiliating way. It is said that he could no longer bear to see himself and ordered all mirrors removed from his chamber. While still alive, he had become a decaying corpse, the most tragic symbol of his own reign. The elaborate court protocol that had been maintained at Versailles for over a century also disintegrated. Ceremonies were abandoned. Many servants fell ill or simply fled their posts. The carefully structured hierarchy collapsed in the face of death. Madame du Barry, the woman closest to the king, was expelled from Versailles, regarded both as a source of scandal and potential contagion. Her departure left Louis entirely alone in his last days. His final days alternated between fevered delirium and brief moments of lucidity. At times he was said to have begged forgiveness from God and his people, but such moments of repentance were overshadowed by the horrific reality of his decaying body. His agony was so unbearable that even those hardened to the cruelties of the 18th century were shaken. On May 10, 1774, after 2 weeks of torment, Louis XV succumbed to smallpox. In his last moments, his body convulsed violently before falling still. The man who had been the embodiment of absolute monarchy died in conditions that would have been considered degrading even for a common criminal. With his death, the aura of majesty surrounding the monarchy also collapsed. Instead of the magnificent mourning rituals traditionally held for a king, the atmosphere in France was one of relief, even celebration. In Paris, news of his death was greeted with applause, while church bells remained silent. The man once known as Louis the Well-Beloved was now neither mourned nor missed. The true shame, however, came at the funeral. His body had decayed so severely from disease that the usual preparations could not be carried out. Even embalmers refused to work due to the stench. He was hastily sealed in a lead coffin and rushed to the Royal Basilica of St. Denis. The funeral, which should have been open to public homage, was cancelled on grounds of health concerns. The procession was a parody of royal dignity. Only a few nobles attended, while the crowd looked on with curiosity rather than respect. Instead of a grand royal farewell, it resembled the hurried disposal of a dangerous burden. After nearly 60 years on the throne, the king was sent to his final rest, not in glory, but in disgrace. The death of Louis XV continued to cause problems. For the monarchy, even after his body had been laid to rest, the sealed lead coffin, intended to contain the decay, could not suppress the stench, making the funeral at St. Denis nearly unbearable. Some participants fell ill, whether from fear of contagion or the overwhelming odor. The bishop conducting the service was forced to shorten the traditional rituals, turning the funeral from a solemn commemoration into a shameful necessity that tarnished the king's dignity. For contemporary observers, this scene was no coincidence. The rotting body symbolized the moral corruption that had defined Louis XV's reign. The contrast between the magnificent funeral of Louis XIV and the rushed, humiliating burial of his successor laid bare the monarchy's decline and loss of prestige. Pamphlets and satirical songs spread quickly among the people, comparing the two kings and mocking the failures of the current royal leadership. When Louis XVI ascended the throne, he was only 20 years old and inexperienced in government. The horrific death of his grandfather underscored the fragility of the monarchy he inherited. The people had already lost faith in the divine nature of kingship. Now, it was clear that a king could succumb to disease and death, just like any ordinary subject. Across Europe, reactions were mixed. Official condolences were sent, yet behind closed doors, many courts expressed satisfaction that France had been rid of such an ineffective ruler. Rumors about the king's final days became fodder for diplomatic gossip, further eroding France's already weakened reputation. The French monarchy, once the model of absolutism, had become an object of pity and ridicule. Louis XV's greatest legacy was the crushing financial crisis he left behind. The national debt had reached catastrophic levels, making fundamental reform unavoidable. Yet the same obstacles, the privileges of the nobility and clergy, the resistance of vested interests, and the monarchy's lack of resolve remained in place. From the very beginning, Louis XVI faced the same deadlocks that had suffocated his grandfather. This structural crisis would soon ignite the flames of the French Revolution. But people's anger did not vanish with the king's death. Tax injustice, aristocratic privilege, and the endless burden on the poor continued. The hated king was gone, but the hatred now shifted toward the monarchy itself. International decline also persisted. France had lost its colonial empire and was weakened permanently in the face of Britain and Austria. Louis XV's attempt to restore French prestige by supporting the American Revolution brought only temporary hope, but in the end deepened the financial crisis without securing lasting gains. The Enlightenment ideas that had flourished under Louis XV had already transformed society's view of monarchy. It was no longer believed that the problem lay with one particular king. The system itself was seen as corrupt. By 1774, revolutionary ideas had fully taken root in French political culture. Louis XV's death became more than the fall of a single ruler. It was a metaphor for the decay of the entire old order. Revolutionaries used the grotesque image of his final days as propaganda. His bodily corruption was proof that monarchy was inherently degenerate. The public's reaction to his death was the clearest alarm for the monarchy's future. If the king's passing could be celebrated openly, mocked without consequence, then royal authority had already collapsed in the eyes of the people. This rupture would soon provide revolutionaries with the popular support they needed to bring down the monarchy altogether. The decaying body and torments of Louis XV became some of the most powerful evidence that monarchs, too, are mortal. The supposed divine privileges that set kings above their people were shattered by the stark reality of his death. Disease strikes all equally. The democratic nature of smallpox offered one of history's most striking lessons on human equality. The journey from Louis the Well-Beloved to Louis the Hated entered history as a cautionary tale of the corrupting effects of absolute power. His reign demonstrated plainly that a monarchy based solely on tradition and coercion could not survive without popular support. The consequences of this failure were studied by political theorists and reformers across Europe, helping to lay the foundations for constitutional government, representation, and popular sovereignty. The life of Louis XV stands as one of history's most dramatic falls. A child king who ascended the throne adored by his people. He died despised as a tyrant, his body literally rotting away, scorned by those he ruled. His death was the fitting end to a reign that had already begun to collapse from within. The horrific scene of his final days was not just a historical curiosity, but also a metaphor. The stench that spread from his chambers symbolized the moral and political corruption that had engulfed the monarchy. His diseased and abandoned body mirrored the condition of his kingdom, sick, helpless, and on the brink of collapse. The king, who had once been a beacon of hope in his youth, became, in the end, the architect of his nation's disgrace. His failure to summon the moral courage to act for his people's welfare proved that, in any age and under any system, leadership requires responsibility and accountability. His failures affected not only France but all of Europe. France's weakness shifted the balance of power. Its colonial losses opened opportunities for Britain, while other powers pursued more aggressive policies. Thus, internal decay reshaped the continent's future. The greatest lesson was this: systems without accountability collapse under their own weight. The absolutism that had elevated France to its peak under Louis XIV dragged it into humiliation under his successor. The fragility of institutions that refused to adapt and ignore the grievances of their people was revealed in stark relief during Louis XV's reign. After his death, the image of his rotting corpse became a potent weapon of revolutionary propaganda. The corruption of royal authority appeared in books, pamphlets, and caricatures. In this way, Louis inadvertently became a symbol of the necessity for governments based on consent rather than tyranny. Even today, the story of Louis XV remains relevant. It offers a timeless warning about the dangers of unchecked power, unresponsive rule, and postponed problems. It reminds us that even the most deeply rooted institutions will collapse once they lose the trust of the people. His decaying body signaled not just the end of a king, but the death knell of absolute monarchy in France.